I'd always been wary of dating apps, but after months of solitude and some convincing from friends, I finally downloaded Tinder. It was mostly out of boredom, a way to pass the time. Swiping left and right became a mindless routine until I matched with Laura. Her profile picture was stunning. Dark hair cascading over her shoulders, deep brown eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. We exchanged messages for a few days, and she was charming, intelligent, and funny. She suggested we meet for coffee, and despite the nagging feeling in my gut, I agreed. We met at a small, cozy cafe downtown. Laura was even more beautiful in person, and conversation flowed easily. I found myself genuinely enjoying her company. As we talked, I noticed she had a peculiar habit of glancing around the room, almost as if she was expecting someone. When I asked about it, she brushed it off, saying she was just a bit paranoid from a past experience. I didn't press further, not wanting to ruin the mood. After an hour or so, she suggested we go for a walk. The sun was setting, casting an orange hue over the city. We strolled through the park, talking about everything and nothing. It was there, on a dimly lit path, that she asked if I believed in ghosts. I laughed it off, thinking she was joking, but her expression remained serious. She told me a story about how she'd once lived in a haunted house, describing eerie occurrences with such detail that it sent chills down my spine. Despite the growing unease, I found myself captivated by her words. As the night grew darker, she suggested we go back to her place, just a few blocks away. My better judgment screamed at me to decline, but curiosity and a strange sense of compulsion drove me to accept. Her apartment was on the top floor of an old building, and as we climbed the creaking stairs, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to the ghost stories she'd told. Her apartment was sparsely furnished, with an almost clinical cleanliness. She poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat on the couch, continuing our conversation. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and shadows seemed to dance in the corners of the room. Out of nowhere, she asked if I wanted to see something truly frightening. Before I could respond, she stood up and walked to a closet, retrieving a small, ornate box. She placed it on the coffee table and opened it, revealing an old, tattered diary. She handed it to me, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The diary belonged to a man named Jacob, who had lived in the same apartment in the 1920s. His entries detailed a descent into madness, claiming that he was being watched, haunted by a dark presence that lived within the walls. The final entry was a scrawled message, barely legible. "It's here. It's always been here." A sudden chill filled the room, and the lights flickered. I looked up at Laura, but her demeanor had changed. Her eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth they once held. She began to speak in a low, monotone voice, recounting how every tenant since Jacob had either disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. She claimed the apartment was cursed, that it fed on the souls of those who lived there. I tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was all an elaborate joke, but the fear in her eyes told me otherwise. The atmosphere grew tense, and I could feel an oppressive force closing in around me. Panic set in, and I decided it was time to leave. I stood up, making some excuse about an early morning, but Laura blocked my path. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It won't let you." Before I could react, the room plunged into darkness. I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my arm, and a surge of terror paralyzed me. I struggled to free myself, but the grip tightened. A raspy, disembodied voice echoed through the apartment, whispering my name, promising eternal torment. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, I managed to break free and stumbled towards the door. Laura screamed, a blood-curdling sound that still haunts my dreams. I fumbled with the lock, finally wrenching the door open and sprinting down the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. I never went back to that part of town again. I deleted Tinder and changed my number, paranoid that Laura, or whatever was in that apartment, would somehow find me. Nights are the worst. I can still hear her voice, that haunting whisper, promising that it's not over. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to the sensation of cold, clammy hands gripping my arm. It's been months, but the fear hasn't faded. I've moved twice since then, always looking over my shoulder, always feeling watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sends me into a panic. I don't know what was in that apartment, and I don't want to know. But I can't escape the feeling that it's still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't tell many people about that night. Who would believe me? They'd think it was just another ghost story, a figment of an overactive imagination. But I know what I experienced was real. And as much as I try to convince myself otherwise, deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. I never imagined that swiping right could change my life so dramatically. It all started innocently enough, a few months after a painful breakup. My friends insisted I get back out there, so I reluctantly downloaded Tinder. It felt strange, almost invasive, to be judging people by their photos and brief bios, but I eventually got used to it. One profile caught my eye. His name was Ethan. He had dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that seemed genuine. His profile was well written, and he mentioned a love for horror movies and late-night drives. We matched, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. Ethan suggested we meet for dinner at a new restaurant in town. It had an eerie, gothic theme, which he thought would be fun. I was nervous but excited, hoping this might be the start of something new. The night of our date, I dressed carefully, wanting to make a good impression. As I approached the restaurant, a sense of unease settled over me, but I brushed it off as first date jitters. Ethan was waiting for me outside. He was even more striking in person, and his smile put me at ease. We went inside, and the restaurant's dim lighting and elaborate decor created an almost theatrical atmosphere. We talked for hours, sharing stories and laughing more than I had in a long time. When the check came, he insisted on paying, and I thanked him, feeling a warm blush creep up my cheeks. After dinner, Ethan suggested we take a walk. The night air was cool, and the streets were quiet. We wandered through a nearby park, the only sounds being our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. We found a bench near a small pond, and he pulled out a flask, offering me a sip of whiskey. I hesitated, but took a small sip to be polite. It burned going down, but the warmth spread through my chest. Ethan seemed lost in thought, staring at the water. When I asked him what he was thinking, his expression darkened. He started talking about his ex-girlfriend, how their relationship had ended badly. His tone was bitter, and it made me uncomfortable. He noticed my unease and quickly changed the subject, but the atmosphere had shifted. As it got later, I decided it was time to head home. Ethan offered to walk me back to my apartment, and I accepted, not wanting to seem rude. We walked in silence, the streets now deserted. When we reached my building, I thanked him for the evening and turned to go inside. He grabbed my arm, not hard, but firm enough to stop me. "I had a great time tonight," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I'd like to see you again." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Me too. I'll text you." I could feel his eyes on me as I walked up the steps and into my apartment. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it with a sigh of relief. Something about the end of the night had left me unsettled, but I tried to shake it off. I changed into my pajamas and got into bed, exhaustion quickly pulling me into sleep. That night, I had the most vivid nightmare. I was running through a dark forest, branches clawing at my skin. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. When I glanced back, I saw Ethan, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He was smiling, but it was twisted, menacing. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It took me a few moments to realize I was safe in my bed. The next morning, I checked my phone to find several messages from Ethan. He was asking if I had slept well and suggesting we meet up again soon. The eagerness in his texts made me uneasy, but I replied politely, saying I was busy with work. For the next few days, he kept messaging me, his tone growing more insistent. One night, I came home to find a small package on my doorstep. There was no note, just a plain brown box. I brought it inside and opened it cautiously. Inside was a beautiful silver necklace with a delicate pendant shaped like a heart. There was no indication of who it was from, but I had a sinking feeling it was from Ethan. I decided to confront him, texting him to ask if he had sent the necklace. His reply came almost immediately, confirming my suspicion. He said he thought it would look perfect on me, that he couldn't stop thinking about me. His words were flattering, but also suffocating. I realized then that I needed to cut ties with him. I sent him a message, thanking him for the gift, but explaining that I wasn't ready for a relationship. His response was cold and terse. I tried to go about my life, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I started noticing a dark sedan parked near my apartment, always at different times of the day. My paranoia grew, and I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. One night, as I was heading home from work, I saw the sedan again, parked at the end of my street. I quickened my pace, my heart racing. When I reached my door, I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get inside. Just as I got the door open, I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. I screamed and spun around to see Ethan standing there, his eyes wild. "You can't just ignore me," he hissed. "We have something special." I tried to push him away, but he was too strong. He forced his way inside, slamming the door behind him. Panic surged through me as he advanced, his expression twisted with rage. I grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it at him, catching him off guard. He stumbled, and I took the opportunity to run to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I frantically called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I could hear Ethan pounding on the door, shouting obscenities. The operator stayed on the line with me, assuring me that help was on the way. Those minutes felt like hours, the door splintering under his relentless assault. Finally, I heard the sirens, and moments later, the pounding stopped. The police arrived just in time, dragging Ethan away in handcuffs. I watched from the safety of my window as they took him to the squad car, his eyes still fixed on me with that terrifying intensity. Ethan was charged with stalking and breaking and entering. I changed my locks, my number, and even moved to a new apartment. But the fear never fully left me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone lurking just out of sight. Tinder was deleted from my phone, and I vowed never to use a dating app again. The nightmares continued, and I often woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, haunted by the memory of his twisted smile. I've always been a night owl, my best ideas coming to me in the witching hours when the world is asleep. One such night, in a fit of insomnia and loneliness, I downloaded Tinder. It was more out of curiosity than anything else. Swiping left and right became a way to pass the time until sleep claimed me. Then I matched with Alice. Alice was stunning, with long auburn hair, green eyes that seemed to pierce through the screen, and an enigmatic smile. Her profile was minimal, just a quote, "In the end, we only regret the chances we didn't take." We chatted for a few days, and I was drawn to her wit and the subtle darkness in her humor. She was different, intriguing. When she suggested we meet, I didn't hesitate. We agreed to meet at a bar downtown. It was a place I'd never been before, tucked away in an alley, almost hidden, the kind of place that felt like a secret. I arrived first, the dimly lit bar exuding an old-world charm. I chose a booth in the corner and ordered a drink, my nerves buzzing with anticipation. Alice arrived a few minutes later, more breathtaking in person. She slid into the booth with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. We talked, our conversation flowing effortlessly. There was an intensity to her, something magnetic that I couldn't quite place. Hours passed like minutes, and before I knew it, the bar was closing. She suggested we continue the night at her place. Normally, I would have declined, preferring the safety of public spaces on a first date. But something about her made me throw caution to the wind. We walked to her apartment, a few blocks away. It was in an old, imposing building that seemed out of place among the modern structures around it. Her apartment was on the top floor. It was spacious and tastefully decorated, but there was a strange, almost oppressive atmosphere. I noticed she had a lot of mirrors, large and small, placed in odd locations. They seemed to catch and distort the light in unsettling ways. We sat on her couch and she poured us both a glass of wine. As we sipped our drinks, the conversation took a darker turn. Alice began talking about her fascination with the supernatural, how she believed that mirrors were portals to other realms. Her eyes gleamed with an intensity that made me uneasy. She asked if I believed in spirits and other worlds. I laughed it off, saying I was a skeptic, but she didn't seem to hear me. She stood up and walked to one of the larger mirrors, her reflection almost blending with the shadows. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She beckoned me over, and against my better judgment, I followed. She handed me a small, ornate box, urging me to open it. Inside was an old, tarnished key. She explained that it was an antique, passed down through her family, and that it was said to open a door to another dimension. I laughed nervously, but she remained deadly serious. "Let's try it," she said, her eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to refuse, to leave, but something in her gaze held me captive. She led me to a door at the end of the hallway. It looked like a regular closet door, but as I inserted the key and turned it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The door swung open to reveal a pitch-black room. The air was frigid, and the darkness seemed to pulse alive. Alice stepped inside and I followed, the door closing behind us with a finality that made my heart race. The room was unnaturally cold, and I could hear a faint whispering like voices just out of reach. Alice's face was illuminated by an eerie light that seemed to come from nowhere. "This is where they come through," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "The spirits, the lost souls, they're drawn to the mirrors." I turned to leave, but the door had disappeared, replaced by a wall of mirrors. Panic set in as I saw our reflections, distorted and twisted. Alice's reflection grinned, a malevolent smile that didn't match her expression. She stepped closer to the mirrors, her hand reaching out to touch the glass. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. Alice was now chanting softly, her eyes closed, swaying as if in a trance. The reflections in the mirrors began to shift, the figures moving independently of us. I screamed at her to stop, to let me out, but she didn't seem to hear me. The reflections grew more grotesque, their eyes hollow and accusing. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if icy fingers were gripping my heart. Desperation took over, and I grabbed Alice, shaking her, trying to break her trance. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment they were pitch black, void of any humanity. She smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and whispered, "It's too late." The mirrors shattered, the sound deafening. Shards of glass flew around us, and I felt a searing pain as they cut into my skin. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the whispering turned into agonized screams. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, the pain unbearable. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of the bartender shaking me awake. The bar was empty, the lights dimmed. He told me I had passed out, that Alice had left hours ago. My head was throbbing, and I felt a dull ache all over my body. I looked around, confused and disoriented. I stumbled out of the bar, my mind racing. The night air was cool, and I tried to steady my breathing. I decided to look up Alice's profile again, to make sense of what had happened. But when I searched for her profile was gone. No trace of her remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The nightmares began that night, vivid and terrifying. I would see Alice's twisted reflection, hear the whispering voices, feel the cold grip of unseen hands. I moved, changed my number, but nothing helped. I started seeing reflections out of the corner of my eye, even when there were no mirrors. I could feel the cold, hear the whispers, always just out of reach. I knew then that whatever I had unleashed that night wasn't bound by walls or doors. It was with me, always watching, always waiting. Now I avoid mirrors as much as possible, but sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the glass, something that isn't me, and I know that one day it will come for me. The spirits, the lost souls, whatever they are, they won't let me go.